everybody to another episode of Coach's Corner, and probably our biggest and best yet. We've got the heavy hitters on tonight.
There we go. Gotcha.
Oh, he's on.
Sorry,
so
man.
Yes, no, you're fine. So yeah, we've got the two heavy hitters on tonight, and we're going to be talking all things bodybuilding and comp prep. And I did do some stories online, and I had a heap of people message me a ton of questions. But just for the sake of time, I've picked out some of the good ones. And then, guys, what I'll ask you is if you've got anything that you want to ask any of us, just type it in the chat box at the bottom, and we'll endeavour to get to it towards the end. But for now, I'm just going to go through and go through the ones that I thought were fantastic. So what I might do, I might just get you both to introduce yourself. And then from there, what we'll do is, just because the two of you at the moment are kind of on opposite worlds in terms of where you're at with your fitness journey. One peak in off season, I saw Scott your full day reading the other day, which was massive, man, and that's probably Trimboli's whole week of carbs at the moment. So it just shows how far apart you can be. But maybe MT, do you want to go first?
Actually, I can't see you guys. It says connecting on my end. Can you see me?
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Interesting. I can't see anything, but I can talk into a blank camera. That's fine.
Well, we can see you. You're good.
Okay, that's weird. Maybe I'll try to come out and rejoin. We'll see what happens. Let me have a look.
You can go first, Scotty.
What's that, mate? You want me to go first? Okay, no drama.
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, cool. So, my name's Scott Morrell. So, obviously, I'm the owner at Powerhouse Strength Conditioning. So, I run a strength and conditioning gym in Montmorency, but we also do quite a lot of online coaching, so in the physique space, so similar to yourself and to Michael. But yeah, I've been in the industry for 15 years now, so he's back.
Good. You can see everything. Good.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I work with predominantly physique-based athletes at the moment, but I do have a couple of just Gen Pop based people that I work with who buy online that obviously want to improve aesthetics, get stronger, change composition, etc. But in a nutshell, man, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, so Scott obviously coached me for my last comp. And as an athlete, Scott, fitness and physique pro?
Yeah, so that was me on a professional level. So as an athlete, yeah, so I compete within the natural bodybuilding realm. So I compete with ICN. And I'm a ICN men's fitness pro and an ICN men's physique pro. So, and as you said before, currently very deep in the off season at the very different end that MT is currently in. So, it's good.
And we're going to come back to Scotty's off season in just a moment, but we'll flip over to MT. And for those that don't know, which I'd be surprised at anyone that doesn't, but.
Yep. So, hey everyone, Michael Trimboli. Been full-time coaching since the start of 2017, end of 2016, end of 2017. Predominantly coaching female athletes, natural female athletes, and it's fun. It's interesting. Every day is a challenge, but is also definitely a reward. And I absolutely love this sport. I love speaking to like-minded people, meeting like-minded people, and also trying to grow this sport and better this sport any way we possibly can. So I love the fact that we're doing this and we're having a chat, and hopefully people get a lot out of it. For myself, competitively, I haven't competed since 2011. So it's been a long time. Jumping on stage season B this year.
Just a few years.
Yeah, just a while. Let me just give you some context. So back then, there was no posing coaches, there was no tanners, there was no comp prep coaches. Everything you had to do was you had to do it yourself. You went on bodybuilding.com forums, you looked at articles, you talked to people at the gym, and you just kind of figured it out as you went. So it's changed a little bit since I competed. Back then, let's talk about female categories, for instance. Back then, there was one female category in a show. It was called models, and there was 8 people in a lineup. Now we can tell it's a hell of a lot different now, where females predominantly within the shows over males. So it's changed a hell of a lot, and I can't wait to jump on stage and bring my best.
Yeah, well, we're definitely pumped, man. Obviously, it's been a long time, and I've seen the photos from back in the day. So very keen to see what is the MT of 10 years later with all that extra muscle tissue.
2.0.
Yeah.
2.0.
It's
So very
good.
exciting.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to do, because I actually had a couple of people ask, was just in relation, Scott, to your off season. And like, guys, we probably should preface this by saying, like, you know, whatever Scott's eating in terms of his nutritional intake is obviously very specific to him, and he's built up to this. And I'll get you to give us a little bit of insight as to how long it's taken you throughout your off season to get to the point you're at now, and then maybe tell us exactly the total split macros and everything.
Yeah, cool. So, yeah, firstly, as you alluded to, I don't know why there seems to be, just within natural bodybuilding, there's almost like an obsession around how much people eat, and in the off season, you know, how much you can eat to put on size, and then what you're dieting on, and how much you can get away with whilst you're dieting. When really, what I eat, or what Michael Trimboli eats versus Michael Galante, it's going to be so different because we're just different human beings. So my intakes compared to someone else's are obviously, they're not even going to be in the same comparison. But essentially, I will say that I am probably a little bit gifted metabolically in terms of just the way I've always been, in terms of being able to tolerate eating, quite a lot of food and not necessarily gaining quite a lot of body composition. I would say in terms of a skeletal structure, I'm probably more of a ecto to mesomorph, as opposed to, say someone's an endomorph, they're a bit bigger, they're going to be able to store composition perhaps a little bit easier. But really, I guess it goes through stages. So, for example, when I first came out of contest prep, for those that don't know, I competed during 2020 at the end of the pandemic, and towards the back end of that was pretty much close to 40 weeks of dieting. I was pretty much sitting at maintenance for like the last 8 weeks of prep because I was ready pretty early. And that was, I think it was probably sitting around the low 3000s, to be honest. And then from there, obviously, I was pretty lean for that show. And so straight away, as we tend to do now with leaner athletes, I employed a recovery diet. So I wanted to gain some initial fat mass virtually straight away, because as a human being, I was pretty much shot. So that meant taking my food up pretty high pretty quickly to try and get a response, to put some fat mass on straight away to try and attenuate some of the adaptations that come obviously with, a prolonged dieting period. And I think that was already like 4,200. And then after a week, I'd like stagnated. So had to push more and more and more in. And then when you get to a point where it was probably around about May, to be honest, where I'd probably hit the ceiling, where this is about 5 months after my prep, maybe even 6 months, where I actually felt 100% normal again. And that might sound a bit strange to some people, but when you go sort of really far down the rabbit hole, sometimes it does take quite a while to come out the other side. And then I think that settled probably around the low 5,000 mark. And then from there, I continued to push my growth phase up until about November last year, where I actually had to run a mini cut potentially a little bit earlier than I'd planned. And that was, I had a wedding, and the suit fitting I had done 3 months prior, there was no way to make changes in it. About 4 weeks before the wedding, I couldn't get my wedding pants on. And my wife said, Scott, you can't wear them. So we had to clean things up for a little bit. But I think the ceiling on how high it went was maybe like low to mid 5,000s. And at the moment it's hovering around about 4,800. But the last 2 weeks I've had a weight plateau. I've just been hovering in that mid 98 range. So unfortunately, it's probably going to mean I'm going to have to make another push probably end of the week.
Yeah, and fair to say, like, at this point, you're reasonably uncomfortable with the amount of food?
Yeah.
Or not yet?
Getting pretty close. Like, it's funny when you're in prep, like Trimboli is probably sitting there now thinking like, man, I would do anything and everything to be able to delete 4,000 calories, potentially in 2 days rather than just in an entire week. But it's like, it does get to the point where when you do address, like when you come out of prep and your hunger signaling goes back to normal, you just don't have any desire to eat. So without doubt, I wake up at 4:45. My first meal goes down at 5:15, and it's 1,200 calories. The last thing I want to do is eat that. But it's one of those things where you got to force feed. It's very rarely that I'll be like, I'm really, really hungry and I want to eat. But unfortunately, that's just a byproduct of being on the other side of the fence when you're in the off season. If you want to, accrue new tissue, then you need to put yourself in a positive, energetic environment, which means, unfortunately, sometimes force feeding. And that's obviously going to be different for everyone. So for me, unfortunately, it means my food does have to get quite high. versus someone else might be able to get away with like only having to push up to 3,200 calories, which again, they might think, I wish I could eat more, but there's pros and cons to both of it.
Definitely, yeah. And I think there's
I've got a question.
People on.
Can I ask a question to Scott? Hey,
Yeah,
you know how you said, was it 5-6 months after comp you started to feel normal again? What was your body weight, and were you a different composition? Like when did you find, is there like a sweet spot where your body started to feel normal again?
Yeah, I think, well, probably, it's hard to tell as well because we actually had a baby, my wife and I had a baby in October, like smack bang, 4 weeks out from the show. So, like, I was cooked from being, you know, my glutes were in from about 8 weeks out from when I actually competed, like, fully. So, I was super shredded and I was also super sleep deprived as well. So, that probably didn't really help the cause. So, coming out of prep, I felt pretty sucky, probably until maybe like January. I started to feel a bit better when I had maybe 4 or 5 kilos of fat mass on me. But stage weight wise, I got down to like, I had this conversation with you a little while ago, MT. I think off the top of my head, I think it was like maybe like fasted weights of like 80. I think maybe a couple of times when I had like a 79.7. But at my very lowest, I was like hovering around the 80 kilogram range. And it was probably not really until I got up to maybe, I'm going to say probably about 10, 12% above stage weight that I really start. Like, you obviously feel better when you're eating a little bit more and obviously you're training, but it wasn't truly until like probably close to 90 kilos that I was like, you know, you think you feel good at like 85, 86, and then you start to see linear progression in the gym, like lifts going back to where they were, and just your overall, you know, potentially demeanor. Like, you probably come across as being a little bit more happier than when you're at the back end of prep. You tend to drag your feet a bit, you know, colors don't quite seem as vibrant. You know what it's like.
I think the biggest one that you raised was around that hunger signaling. I think that's the thing that's, you know, for me, I'm about 8 weeks post-show, has taken the longest to recover. I still feel like I could eat all the time.
Yeah, and we actually had that conversation the other day where you're like, you know, I feel like I'm pretty good and I'm there. But when we actually looked at some of your hunger rating columns, so we for those that are watching, we track Michael's satiety and his hunger in a column. So that gives us an idea of, you know, whether those hormones are actually signaling correctly. And so whilst, yes, he feels like he's kind of satiated, but his hunger column is still quite high, that tells us that, you know, his endocrinology hasn't really returned to baseline where it was when you started preparation, or say 4 weeks in, where, you know, you could look at, I don't know, a bowl of pasta and be like, yeah, I could eat it, or honestly, I don't really feel like eating that. So, and that's one of those things that there's no magic number for that. It's just time, and everyone's going to be different.
Yeah, definitely. So, guys, what we're going to do is I'm just going to read out some of the topics that I'm going to ask the boys about. And then, as I said at the start, anyone that wants to ask anything else, just throw it in the chat box at the bottom, and we'll do our best to get to it. But one of the things I wanted to go through, I'll give you the list. Wanted to talk through the ideal length of prep and why you think that is the best length of time for a prep. And I know that there's no perfect scenario, but I'm sure you've got some parameters that you generally use. Refeeds, I want both your opinions on refeeds, whether you use them, what your thoughts are, and just talking about how you set up your diets when you set a prep up in terms of the phases and stuff. So if you don't mind, we'll start with the ideal length of prep. MT, have you got a sort of specific number that you use every time, or do you just base it on, you know, the client's individual appearance at the time?
Yeah, both, to be honest. You know, because I work predominantly with females, you know, we have to really decide what category they're going to do first to find out their level of conditioning, what they need to look like on stage, see where they're at now, and then kind of decide how long their prep should be. So, like, for instance, if someone in the off-season comfortably stays at a lower level of body fat than the average person, and they've only got to do a bikini division, maybe the prep's only 16, 20 weeks, right? But if someone's a little bit heavier in the off-season, naturally they hold on to a little bit more body fat, and they've got to go all the way down to fitness, which is a lot leaner. It could be 26, 28 weeks. We try to give ourselves more time so we can take a slower, steady approach and overcome any plateaus along the way. But that's kind of the band that I kind of sit in. I'm going to sit in between that 16 to 26, just to give it, if you wanted to have a number. But
yeah. Like I said, very generalized, but like at least a ballpark of, you know, that we're not really speaking to anyone as coaches having a first consult these days, talking about a 12-week prep.
Oh, no. And you guys are probably the same. Like, you want to work with someone a lot before prep starts to make sure that metabolism's in a good position. Obviously, their physique from a muscularity, proportion, symmetry perspective is all pretty much on point before you start a prep, because prep is just basically a long fat loss phase. You can't guarantee you're going to be gaining a lot of muscle or making a lot of shape change during that time. So you want to make sure that everything is set up, ready to go, so that your body will outlast that extended fat loss phase. So I think, the length of prep is obviously going to dictate someone's metabolism too. If someone doesn't have the best metabolism, might be more of a slower, steadier approach along that way. So I think having more time is always going to be better. One thing that I learned last year, which was a really, really good learning experience, was because shows in season B were pushed out from like September, October to December, allowing people to eat up during that time and having I don't even want to call it a diet break. It's more like reversing them slightly and then dieting them down longer.
Yeah, back again.
I found that just like they could diet on higher calories, they got leaner than probably what they could have prior to that.
And the mental break as well?
Yeah, mental break. They actually you would see some shape changes and maybe some gains during that like little reverse time when we knew the shows were going to be pushed out. So always more time is better. It doesn't mean that if you say to someone you're going to have a 30-week prep, that it's just going to be 30 weeks of hell and dieting the whole time. There's probably most likely going to be breaks along the way and a slow approach or even an undulating approach. So that's kind of my high-level view of the length of prep.
Yeah. And obviously, like I said, a general question. And both Michael and Scott have now both prepped me, so I already know Scott's answer. But Scott, I'll get you to run through it yourself.
Yeah, so kind of similar to what Michael said. I think it really just depends, firstly, on the individual, but also on the category. I mean, I typically, I don't just work with males. I work with probably a mixed blend, but it's probably 60% male, 40% female, maybe a little bit higher in the male column now. But having advantage of, as you just alluded to, time. So it's very rare that I'll work with anyone. They'll come to me at 20 weeks out and say, I want to do a contest prep. Nearly everyone that's about to do a show, like all my season B guys now, I've been working with for, a number amount of time. And I think it's so important because not only, you can get their metabolic capacity in order, but I think as well, when you start a prep, especially if it's your first time, it's important to have a period where you just sort of encompassing all of the habitual things that come with bodybuilding. So, for example, you might think that you train hard and then, you've got Michael Galante or Michael Trimboli doing your programming, and then you come out after a week and you're like, well, I thought I was training hard and now I actually know what training hard is. Or I thought I was, equating enough volume and obviously now I understand what that actually looks like. So I think from that aspect of it, it's good because you can kind of embed certain habits, but also just basic protocols. Like for a lot of people, weighing their food can be like, whoa, what are you doing? Whereas for us three, you probably don't put anything on your plate that hasn't been weighed in order to be able to measure that. So for the average Joe, there are things that they need to learn and encompass. And it also, you get some of those teething problems out of the way earlier. And it's better to do that when there's no consequences or recoil on the other side. And then I think the other thing as well is you sort of get a bit of an idea how the individual works or how they respond. So if you're working with females, when they get their cycle, what typically tends to happen with that. So that, for example, when you're in a prep, and then out of nowhere, you might get this random increase. And if you haven't worked with this athlete before and you don't understand that, or you might not be aware that when they typically, or premenstrual, when they're going to get their period, that their weight tends to shoot up because they're holding more water. And then you panic and you make an unnecessary adjustment. And obviously they pay the price for that, which means that later you pay the price for that. All those things sort of come into it. So I think time is really, really important. But typically I would say for guys, it's probably going to be usually around the 28 week to 20, sometimes 22. It depends. Like, as you know, MG, like I like to run a pre-prep phase prior and leading into the prep so that we can actually clean up some of that initial fat mass earlier. So that obviously if we reduce the net amount that needs to be lost in the prep, it means that we can go hard at the start and obviously get rid of, quite a decent portion of it. And then we've got more time to go slower at the end, because as a physique athlete, obviously there's a ceiling on how much body fat we can actually liberate per unit of energy, per unit of time. So at the back end, you need to factor that in, that you actually need to spend more time at maintenance. You should be doing ideally less cardio at the back end in order to bring in, you know, the best possible physique. Because if you're having to grind all the way to the finish, the likelihood is that you're probably going to sacrifice a bit of lean muscle tissue as a byproduct.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, great answer. So I think like the message being that the approach is pretty consistent, obviously athlete dependent, but longer preps tend to be the way that we all go. Great answers from both of you. The two things we've probably got the most questions about, one being refeeds. Do you guys use them? What's their benefit? And the other one, which always comes up when refeeds come up, is it a refeed or is it a cheat meal or a cheat day? So I know we've all got pretty much the same opinion, but I'll get you two to break that down. Maybe MT, you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. I think like I don't quite like using this at a time, but it's different for everyone. There's some people that I will implement refeeds and some people I won't. Sometimes just habitually people like it that way. So they like it to, you know, have some lower days, have some higher days. That's just like how they like to structure their week and to structure their meals. And that's how they like to eat. Fine. Some people just want one set of calories and macros, and that just makes it easy for them. They don't need to worry about anything. So some people have different preferences, regardless of what may be the best approach physiologically. So I think you need to understand what someone's preference is first. But sometimes we do things that maybe aren't of your preference so that we can get the best result we want. I tend to use them and think of them as a tool to use when you're hitting plateaus or when you think someone needs a break. So I'll give you an example. If you're bringing someone's calories and macros down throughout the prep and you're thinking to yourself, they're starting to plateau out and they're feeling really miserable. Is it just them being a sook, or do you think actually they need a little bit more food just to maybe, you know, stimulate them a little bit more so that then when they go back on those that lower calories, things just start to fire and start to fall off. So I like to use them for that reason there. And I also like to, and they're not a cheat. They're just higher calorie or carbohydrate days. So they're all still measured, tracked, prepared by them. So I like to use them for that purpose too, to break through a plateau, or to use them as a little bit of, I say, okay, you're finding it pretty hard, you're digging pretty deep, and I think you need a little bit of a refresher because things are getting a bit tough and the body's getting a little bit tired. So I use it as a break in the way too.
So there's no set period that you would ever bring that in based on athlete performance, these type of signs.
Yes, definitely I would. I'll be looking at all that kind of stuff too for sure, but I never plan them in advance. So I'd never say, okay, for 2 weeks you're going to do no refeeds, and then in the third week you will, and in 2 weeks you won't. And I never have them set out in advance. It's normally as we go and as we do check-ins and as we're adjusting and as we're getting all that feedback from the client, then we make that decision to be like, I think it's the time that we need to do that. Unless I said we set it up from the start because that's actually how they like to eat. But if we haven't set up from the start that way, then we would be reviewing. We go throughout the prep and then implement them when we think they're necessary, not plan them in advance.
So on the flip side to that, I think both Scott and I tend to pre-plan them, but like it's always indicative. But Scott, you tend to give a pretty good timeline as to like when coming in, if everything is on track as it should be in terms of, you know, your metrics for rate of loss and these types of things.
Yeah, so I think, and this probably comes back to having a strength and conditioning exercise science background where you tend to be very periodic in like how you map everything out from, you know, longitudinally in that sense. So at the start of my timeline, I'll normally have worked out, obviously it's normally within probably a kilo, how much fat mass I think the athlete needs to shift. And so based on that, I'll then look at our timeline. And so if it's more than say like 15 kilos, if it's a guy, I'm probably like, well, we either didn't really do our pre-prep phase properly, or we're probably a little bit too soft, or if it's 16 kilos, because you're talking about, unless you're going to go down a prep of 32, 34 weeks, then for sure. But essentially, as you know, MG, I like to give a a little bit of a timeline, more so for the athletes, so they have a little bit of an insight in terms of what they can expect along the road and how we're going to set it up. Now, having said that, there's always going to be an element of auto-regulation. So typically for the first, it's normally going to be 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. It'll be a linear dieting approach. And so they'll have a baseline set of intakes that that they follow. And normally the nutrition, and again, as you know, not that I'm against flexible dieting, but I'm a big advocate of following a structured meal plan during the contest prep, simply because I think if you can keep all of your variables consistent, it means that our scale weight data is going to have more correlative power to body composition change. Because if we're eating, potatoes, 2 kilos of Christmas one day, and the next day I have half a bag of lollies in my pre-training meal, and I'm like, oh man, I've got no carbohydrates left, so I'm going to have a tuna salad, then it can give some misleading data. So I think, and also just from a simplistic perspective. Yeah. So I'll normally map all of that out, and then it will typically be from like week 8, then onwards, it might be, we'll aim to refeed 1 to 2 times a week, if that permits. Now, it's also important for people to understand that when we say a refeed, it's not, oh, we're going to do a cheat meal, we're going to go to McDonald's and have anything that's untracked. All we're doing is eating the same foods, but perhaps we're going to throw in more grammage, and typically it'll be carbohydrate, because that's obviously the body's preferred source of energy. But the other reason is because as we tend to get leaner, and again, as I alluded to before, that amount of fat mass that we have, the gap tends to close. And so if you're constantly digging and digging and digging, you have to be willing to understand that the recoil is you're going to sacrifice some lean tissue along the way. And our goal is always to get as lean as possible whilst retaining all of our muscle, which is never going to happen 100%, but the more that we can retain, the better. And the best way to retain muscle tissue in the contest prep is how you go about it in the gym. So if your training performance is lagging, and like MT said before, if you've got someone that's really just not really getting it done in the gym, and maybe they've just been dug a little bit too much, perhaps putting in a couple of refeeds, whether it's 1 day or 2 day, perhaps that can, top up muscle glycogen, and then you yield some good training performance out of it. It really just depends. But typically from 8 week onwards, if it permits within the timeline, the plan would normally be 1 to 2. But having said that, there might be times where we're ahead of schedule and then we need to perhaps slow things down. And then there's times where, you perhaps might have planned to refeed, but that option isn't there if we want to allow, enough time at the back end. And your refeed intakes are always going to change, because as we know, your maintenance calories at the start of prep are not going to be where they are at the end. So obviously that number is constantly changing. Yeah.
And I think we tend to incorporate them when we have these refeeds or increases around training times, pre and post.
Yeah, for sure. So typically we'll do, and I'll normally deposit or I'll program in a refeed. Like, let's say that typically, I think for you, man, when we would put them in, even though you were pretty much eating a maintenance at the back end anyway, but your bigger days were Friday, I think, and Saturday, where you had EB push, EB pull. So, you had a squat variation on one day, and obviously some pressing, and then a deadlift variation and some heavy pulling, doing a hip hinge. So it would make more sense for us to top you up over that Friday, Saturday, because obviously we're going to see hopefully an increase in training performance due to an increase, obviously, in muscle glycogen. But also, we're going to see an increase in recovery. And if you can train hard, recover really well, and that's something that obviously, is a negative when you're in a prep. You're in a deficit, it's hard to recover. But the other really important piece of recovery, if not the most, is obviously your sleep. And I think everyone can relate to, hopefully you're not quite there just yet, man, in your prep where hunger has you wide awake at like 4 a.m. And unfortunately for a lot of us, it's just one of those things that we all, embrace. But the advantage of perhaps you're eating an extra 100 grams of carbohydrates, you go to sleep with a full belly full, worth of food, and you get 8 or 9 hours. The difference that makes in terms of your body's recovery and also your ability to continue to liberate fat is ridiculous. Someone that sleeps 6 hours a night in prep, someone that's sleeping 8 hours, the amount of fat mass that you're going to be able to burn for the person who sleeps more is greater. And I actually thought of you the other day when I was having this conversation with one of my athletes in prep. Now, I remember you always, in your check-ins, you would always have a set day, and it was always after your 10 or 11 hours sleep, where we both knew that you were waking up. You knew you were waking up with a new weekly low, 100% every single time.
Like 16 weeks in a row.
Yep, without doubt. And that's what I mean. And so it's that sort of feedback. And also you knew you could have had a sucky few days and perhaps you didn't get any relief on the scale, but you're like, I know 100% I'm going to train hard on a Saturday.
Yeah.
I'm likely going to have a refeed, and I also know that I'm going to wake up the next day after 10 hours sleep. I'll feel amazing, and I'll have a new lure weight, and that just sort of rolls me into the next week.
Sunday was always my collection day. That's when I jumped on in the morning, and I knew that was the week's worth of work I was going to see it at that point in time. Yes.
Yeah, 100%.
On that about the sleep and the hunger, so I haven't hit that point yet, but one thing I started to feel it at the start. So what I did from, the probably second or third week in is like, I'm going to have a pretty decent meal before I go to bed. So I have a meal, but I try to, like, if I know I'm going to go to bed at a certain time, I will delay that meal as long as I can. I'll sometimes just eat it like in my bedroom and then just put it down and go to sleep. That I'm full and I can get a good 8 hours, because the last thing I want to do is to wake up because I'm hungry. Yeah.
And I think MT, just to touch on your prep again, I think at this point in time, something like 13 or 14 kilos roughly in about the same amount of weeks, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think we were talking the other day and you mentioned that the hunger hasn't quite hit you hard just yet.
No, not at all. No, I feel really good. Hunger hasn't hit me, but I think I was saying to Scotty the other week, like, I'm not a food-focused person. Like, I could not care less, to be honest. I'll just tick the boxes and eat, and I'm pretty happy just to go about my way and not really stress about the fact that I'm missing out on X and Y food. I just don't care.
I think it gets to the point where it's not about the missing out. It turns into just the fatigue, right? Like, it's just not enough. It's never enough. The meal size is never adequate. I think that's when it really starts to get tough. But nice to hear that you haven't hit that yet, man, because you've still got a bit of time. So
yeah.
You know, when you start having a Coke Zero before your meal and you have another one after your meal, you're in a place where
you're deep in.
But at the end of the day, you're in a prolonged period of energy deprivation. So, and again, you could be eating 1,600 calories when you're in your digging phases, and you could have someone that's eating 3,000. It feels just as shit for both parties when you're at a certain composition level, because it's got nothing to do. Realistically, you probably are, if you're eating whatever, you can satiate yourself by eating 500 grams of vegetable and whatever, but you'll still be able to eat more food because that hunger signaling is just completely in the toilet.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
So I think one of the other things I'd love to touch on, and then we might open it up to questions at the bottom, and we've already got a few, but just one thing that I've got a lot of inquiry about and questions is what you both use as, say, your peak week protocol or strategy. And I know, again, it's always athlete dependent, so it's really hard to answer that question exactly, but do you front load, do you back load? Have you got a go-to that you use every time for most of your clients?
Do you want me to go, or?
Again, as you said, it will typically be individual dependent, but firstly, I think too many people make silly mistakes in a peak week simply because, well, firstly, peak week isn't a magic week where all the stars align and all of a sudden you're perhaps 4 kilos over stage weight.
You're not shredded, and then you are shredded.
You water manipulate, you take some salt, and all of a sudden, voila, you look awesome. So I think the key is making sure that your conditioning is already there. But typically, ideally, I like to have run trial peak weeks leading into it. So, for example, we would normally, and again, looking at previous data, whether you respond better on 2 days of back-to-back feeding. Everyone's going to be different. Obviously, at the back end, our nutrient partitioning as naturals is never going to be wonderful. So some people can tolerate, like I'm someone that can take in 600-700 grams of carbohydrate and still wake up flat and need to push in 800 versus some people, everything works in slow motion. You push in 250 and it's like, they've almost spilled over. So, but typically I'll normally just slowly load. So we'll normally run, if it's guys, maybe a 2 day. When I say depletion, it's really just two low days, and then we'd perhaps go 2 down, 2 up, 1 down, and then 1 up, and then just assess. But essentially, it's really going to depend on the look. Like, again, as you know, we're in peak week, like with you, Michael, we were on your carb up days, you were sending photos. How do you look after meal 2? How do you look after meal 3? How did you look in your workout? How was your pump? How did your photos look afterwards? So you're just constantly assessing the look. So you can have all the greatest plans in the world, but if we look at you on a Thursday and we're like, you know what, you look exactly as you need to, we don't need to push any more in, we just need to hold that look, then that's what we'll do. But if we have the ability that, we can, potentially push a little bit more, then obviously that we will. And one thing I will say, and I know that all three of us are on the same page with this, one thing that we never, ever, ever do if anyone's that's watching, and for some reason you'll always get one or two that still, despite there being quite good information out there now, there'll still be people that play around with their water manipulation, and they'll play around with, with sodium. And I think the biggest thing for me is just keeping all of your variables really consistent. So water doesn't really change, other than on the days where I'm pushing in more carbohydrate, I'll typically maybe push in an extra half a litre of water just to help obviously shuttle that carbohydrate in. But otherwise, we're hydrated on the day. And then in terms of pushing in sodium, we don't do anything outside the scope, other than we'll normally use a couple of salt tablets just for the
easy to measure. But I think
and that's literally 20 minutes out. That's right. It's amazing what those little 600 milligram tablets can do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think
all the work prior has been done. So it's not like they are the magic solution. That's just like the sprinkles on the sundae.
Yeah. Do you think what Michael touched on before, where if you've had a long off season with this client, you've probably got a little bit more data coming into peak week than someone you've just started for your first prep?
Yeah, I think so. And that's an advantage.
In terms of how high that ceiling is.
Yeah, you know roughly where it is, but I think as well, sometimes that can drastically change too, because their off-season intakes, what they can tolerate, at 96, 97 kilos versus if they're 76, 77 kilos are going to be different. But typically your refeed intakes, say 4 or 5 weeks out from their first show, that that they should be at maintenance calories. So refeed is not designed to take you above, even though sometimes you may wake up heavier. That's not due to being in a surplus. But we would typically use those as a guide. And then obviously, again, you're auto-regulating. So if, like MG, let's say that you were on 400 grams of carbohydrate, and then your fats were at 50 grams and your protein was consistent at 225, we might keep that the same, except for potentially the day before. One of the changes that I make is I tend to pretty much reduce maybe even more than half of the fiber that we take in. And that's obviously to stop. We don't want anything heavy in our gut. We want to eat low volume based foods. And we'll normally push in some potassium as well. So normally some white potato, banana on the day of the show, because we're also going to be pushing in a little bit of sodium. So it's important to manage that electrolyte balance. But typically we'll slightly drop protein, and that's purely just to aid in digestion. And then again, if you've got an athlete that has perhaps been eating fish in the lead up to it, we will sometimes, I like to use fish as a protein source, fish or chicken, but purely because it's a really light protein source, not because it's the god to shreds and it thins your skin out or anything stupid like that. Like some people might.
But are you sure it doesn't do that? Are you sure?
It's just one of those things where it's super light. You can get your 40 or 50 grams of protein and feel like I didn't even really eat anything. And so it just sits really, really well. And then you wake up just with no food in your stomach. You have a bowel movement, after your breakfast and your coffee, and you're as flat as a tack, and all that carbohydrate is there. And then all you have to do is pump up.
Yeah. And that's also another thing that Scott and I tracked during prep. We did track bowel movements, especially getting closer to show.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because, again, whether you're a coach or if you're a self prepper and you're basing on your scale weight data, it can be very easy to just become married to the number that you see on the scale. But at the end of the day, it's not a scale weight competition, it's a physique competition. So you could lose 400 or 500 grams of body composition in a week of lipid, and you would have no idea because your scale weight data doesn't tell you. But you could have not had a bowel movement, or you could have not slept well, so cortisol levels are high, which results in an increase in mineral corticoids, so you're holding on to more water, and as a result, you get some blurred data. So I think it's important to, again, look at it, and anything that you can track and measure, bowel movements especially, they're going to give you a bit of an indication. And as weird as it sounds, sometimes even that data is pretty consistent. Like if you have there might be 1 or 2 days in your week where you don't have a bowel movement, but again, typically on a Friday I do, and then I wake up Saturday and it's super light. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think the one thing is the three of us tend to track and measure pretty much everything. Just takes all the risk out of it. Do you want to add anything to that, Michael?
Yeah, I think one thing is that, as Scotty said, like peak week is not some kind of magical week. A lot of people come in thinking peak week's going to be the hardest week. It's probably actually the easiest week, to be honest, because it's probably the week where you eat more food, you do less cardio, and your training is probably easier. So it's probably the easiest week of your prep, to be honest, except maybe from like a nerves and a stress perspective, because you know you're going to be on stage half naked. But yeah, like let's talk about food first for peak week, and then we could talk about the other ones. So yeah, like as Scotty said, digestion is going to be super important during that time. Try not to introduce any new foods. Reducing fiber on the back end before you jump on stage. Obviously, you want to keep your midsection as flat as possible. No bloating, no little belly happening there. So food selection is going to be super important. Even your carb up food selection should be the same. Try to be the same carbs that you've had throughout your whole prep. So nothing new there. You know, he already mentioned water and sodium. There should be nothing fancy going on there. Everything's just pretty consistent. You know, at least if anything, if someone's not having enough water, maybe you'd say, okay, we need to bump it up these next 2 weeks before show starts, just to make sure we're hydrated enough. But it should be nothing extreme. It shouldn't be like if someone's going from 2 liters, let's jump into 6. It should be just like, you know, just okay, let's increase a liter. You know what I mean? Like nothing crazy. Same with salt intake. Should be nothing crazy unless they've been doing something really, really wrong they haven't told you about the whole time. Nothing should really change there too. And then obviously, of course, like leading up to the day, you don't want them to have a belly full of water because they're going to wet themselves. So yeah, maybe on the day of the show or a little bit before, you might say, okay, let's reduce it a little bit so you just don't have this water belly and you don't feel like you need to go to the toilet every 2 seconds on the day, because especially with females, things can wreck the tan. So just got to be careful. But yeah, so from food selection and water and sodium, I think we're all on the same page there. Carbing up. So everyone's really different. I think because I work with females and some of his thing was obviously to do with males there, I think maybe the process is a little bit different or even more extreme. But for the females, I don't think it's as extreme as what people need to make it out to be. I really laugh when some coaches show how many carbs they're peaking their bikini athlete on. And I'm just like, what for? Like, they don't even need to be shredded and they haven't even got a lot of muscle. Like, what are you doing, right? All you're gonna have is just like a food belly on stage. So I think people put too much emphasis on the carb up process, especially for a female, especially for specific categories. But majority of the time, let's just talk. We talk majority, but not all the time. But it's going to be some kind of loading later in the week, right? It's going to be lower carbs at the start of the week and loading later in the week. How much carbs is going to depend on a lot of different factors, but normally it gets adjusted along the way as you get feedback from the client, as you see what they look like, scale weight and things like that. So you normally always go in with a position, but that position always changes and maybe changes every day. But most
that was going to be my next question. Are you assessing daily or? Yes.
Yeah. Assessing daily. Yeah.
I know Scott's the same. So.
Yeah. Generally the carbs will be later in the week, but I've had clients where they've been ready so early, the last 2-3 weeks of their comp prep is almost like a reverse, right? So you wouldn't even call it a peak week because they've already been eaten up and they're feeling awesome. Yeah. So everyone is different. You've got some people that, they're more endomorph. So you wouldn't put them on as many carbs as what you would someone else. So there's sometimes you just look at someone's history, their body type, maybe what they were prior to even being fit and healthy, what their body type was. And then that kind of makes a decision too on how hard you would push the carb up. So that's that. Let's talk about cardio real quick. Normally that is tapered down. Towards leading in peak week towards the end of the show. You want to have more recovery. You want to restore the glycogen that's in your legs because normally they're trying to do steps or Stairmaster or something. So you want to reduce that. And the last one was training. So training normally becomes easier towards the end. You don't want to go in there with any DOMs, a lot of fluid retention because you're inflamed because you've been training absolute arse off. You want to go in the show feeling pretty fresh.
We're trying to hold on to those carbs, not go in the gym and train like a beast and just waste all that.
Yeah. The only thing is that maybe the only thing I want to watch out for is that people aren't super lazy, like the day or two leading into the show, that they are still moving and not being a complete couch potato and just eating a lot of carbs. We still want them to be moving a little bit. And sometimes I will opt for some kind of training or maybe a light circuit or something like that, maybe a day or two out. But other than that, it should be a pretty easy week. Should be practicing a lot of your posing and making sure that's down pat, because no matter how good you look, if you can't present it, it's going to be no good. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Great information. I reckon what we'll do now, just for the sake of time, is we might get through some of the questions that have been put in the chat box. So I might go back to you, Scotty.
Yeah, mate.
First one being your expectation of a client, or what are you looking for before agreeing to start a prep?
I guess
firstly, I'll be 10 seconds.
No, you're right. Firstly, would be a time commitment. Like if I've had consults before where someone said, I want to compete and I want to do season B, and this might be like in February, and based on their photos, where they're at, their metabolic health and just their physique, I don't think that there's enough time and that it's worth going through that, because if you're going to go through this process, you want to present the best version of yourself. So I think by pushing things back, it's never going to be a bad thing. And so I think for me, if someone's not willing, if they're engaging in your services and they're asking for your professional opinion, at the end of the day, this is what we do full time. So we've prepped, hundreds of people, and we've seen hundreds of people on stage. So we know if we're saying to you that there's not quite enough time, I think we need to look at, let's focus on some training, let's put some size on you, let's improve metabolic health, and then let's perhaps look at season A or season B next year. If they're not open to that, typically for me, it's probably not someone that we're going to align all that well, because they seem to be, sort of very set in their way. But for the most part, I'm probably fortunate enough, most of the people that I come across are quite receptive, to that. But I think similar to you, MT, I'm sure that there's times where you might have a plan to say, look, we're going to do 2020. I've got guys that are planned for 2025 and 2024. But that's not to say that, sometimes things happen, life might happen. They might randomly decide to go to Europe for 3 months, and then they lose a portion of their off season. So it gets pushed back again. I think, the advantage at the stage is always going to be there, but I'd be keen to know, like, are you very similar in that regard?
Yeah, completely, man. Like, obviously, the first thing I say to people whenever I chat to them on the phone is, I want to know if they understand what getting ready for a show is
signing up for.
Yeah, and like how long it is, because some people think I'll just engage a coach just to do prep only, and prep goes for 12 weeks, right? And this is like, okay, cool. I just need to educate you this on a little bit. So, sometimes planning for a show is like a year in advance, sometimes at a minimum. Yeah. Even if you're an amazing athlete, because you got to think about it. A prep is going to be that, as I said, 16 to 26 weeks. Let's call it, 4 to 6 months. So there's already 4 to 6 months. And then before you start a prep, you want to make sure metabolism's in a good position, your habits are in a good position, and your physique, your symmetry, your proportion, your muscle mass is all going to be enough to be competitive. So if all those boxes aren't ticked, and that's only the main 3, you can't start a prep. And to tick those boxes may take 3, 6 or more months, right, before those boxes can be ticked. So we're just talking about just being in the best position to be your best on stage could be a 12-month process. So then, as you said, you take into consideration, do they have any trips coming up? Do they have any holidays? Some people want to do a certain season over another because they socialize during a certain part of the year. So like, I know clients that would never do a season A because their summer and their start of their year and their January, February are just so social that there's no possible way they could prep for season A. So then that already throws that out the window, right? So you have those kind of discussions too with them to decide when is the right time for them to prep. And I've had those tough discussions too when someone thinks they're ready and they can do it, and you tell them, based on my experience and my knowledge, I don't think that's a good idea. And sometimes they go and they'll find another coach, and that coach will take their money, and then they'll come back to you later. So
and then you end up having to fix them.
Yeah, and then you end up having to fix them. So, I think, having these kind of chats and these discussions and hopefully getting that information out there, makes people understand that prepping for a show is longer than 12 weeks, and getting a coach on board at that point in time too. It's a longer process because things are really competitive, and there's some really good
the standard has evolved.
The standard is awesome. So if you want to do a show and do well and be your best and look the part and be competitive, sometimes it's going to take longer than what you think.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think, like,
always,
you you're coming to a first consult and you're already eating, rabbit food. Where have you got to go? Like,
yeah. Exactly right. And for those that haven't done a show, I think one of the things before, if I typically like, again, to have at least work with someone for a minimum 6 to 9 months prior to even potentially looking at doing a contest prep. But for me, the first sort of hoop to jump through before we can say, yep, this is something that we're definitely ready to do is actually putting them, whether it's a mini cut before their pre-preparatory phase, but giving some guidelines, something that's really like structured and that we need to have 100% adherence. So if we're going to mini cut, we're going to run a cleanup phase for 4 or 6 weeks. Then if you're going out with your friends for your friend's birthday, you're not drinking alcohol and you're not staying out till 2 a.m. We're going out for dinner. You can eat before you go, and then you'll have a long black. Because if you can't do that then, and you can't make a sacrifice for a 4 or 5 week period, it just solidifies that, there's nothing wrong with that. But perhaps right now is not the right time for you to engage in something that, again, if you're going to do it to the level that you need to be competitive, it requires a level of commitment. And again, I'm probably at a stage now where I expect that because I think I go above and beyond, as I know you boys do for your athletes as well. So it's one of those things, if I'm asking for a certain amount of effort from you, then of course you're going to get it from me. But it's a two-way street, and that's why there needs to be open dialogue.
Yeah, that's really important. Like, I think us as coaches, us three, and I'm sure there's other people, we really want to put a good standard of competitor on stage, a really, really good quality. And it's because we really love the sport. We really want that. We really want to give the judges a really hard time, to be honest. So they can't pick, right? And sometimes you need to really see whether your client is committed to putting in the work that's involved to be of the best quality. And not to say that us as coaches, we try to make it as sustainable as it could possibly be and only make them do things that they really necessarily need to do. So we're not trying to make it harder than what it really is, but it's hard. It requires sacrifice, it requires commitment, and it requires for sometimes to live a little bit of a different life that you're probably used to for a short period of time. Yeah.
Scott, this is one that came up for you. What are some of the signals or signs that you're looking for when introducing things like a diet break?
So, firstly, for those that don't know, a diet break is basically just like a multiple refeed day. So a diet break's not, we're going to take a week off and just eat whatever we feel like for a few days. Yeah, and the length of it will really determine, like, is 3 refeed days, I guess you could kind of say it's a diet break, but it's really just eating at maintenance. But it will come down to, again, I like to try and pre-plan one in if I can in advance, and it would normally be after about 11 to sort of 13 weeks of dieting where, perhaps for the first 8 weeks, it was a linear protocol where you were just digging, and then we introduce a refeed. But typically if I see that there is a bit of a drop in training performance, so again, I get all my athletes to log their training numbers, what they got on literally every single set, and I analyze that data each week, and I'll set projections for numbers we need to hit the next week. So if I can see that training performance is going down and you're continuing trying to dig, then sometimes even if you're not and you weren't scheduled to run a diet break, sometimes it's in your best interest to do so, because if you're not getting the return on investment in the gym and everything else is tending to pull you further away, it's better to give up a little bit of territory, feed them a little bit more food, again, put them at where their maintenance level is. And that's also a good exercise to determine where their maintenance calories are, because where they were at the start of prep to 12 weeks in are likely going to be a little bit different. But basically the main things will be if they're having trouble sleeping, if their training performance is really lagging, or if their just recovery is really, really bad. And again, you should know whether some of those things are normal at that stage as well. So if it's a first-time competitor and they're like 4 weeks out, all I can think about is food, I'm so hungry, yada, yada, yada. For all of us three, we're like, well, that's really, really normal. And this is the reason why, because from a physiological perspective, but we know and we have tools to be able to mitigate that. But if you're a first timer, then there are things that you need to learn. And every prep you do, you get better. But essentially, if there are signs that shouldn't be there, if you're 8 weeks in and you're needing to employ, or 6 weeks and you need to employ a diet break, I think you need to assess, are they just really being a little bit too soft and they perhaps need to just like suck it up? This is what we signed up for. it's normal to be a bit hungry. But if they're saying that they feel like shit, they can't sleep, their training's really, really bad, everything else is really bad, they can't function, then I guess it would come down. And you also have to assess, what are their low days like? Like, if you've got someone a female eating 1,600 calories and they're like, I just can't do this, then you're like, well, if you're struggling now and we've still got 8 or 9 kilos to lose and we're 6 or 8 weeks in, then just as a heads up, it's going to get 4 or 5 times worse. It's going to get worse before it gets better. So if you're not willing to embrace that suck, then, you know, perhaps, and there's nothing wrong with that, then maybe it's not for you. That's very rare that, you know, that happens. But for the most part, it's normally going to be on just, I guess, the biomarkers that they're giving you, how they're feeling, and also just looking at how training performance is trending.
Yeah. I think, Scott, one of the things you and I spoke about was, like, if you're regularly hungry in prep, you're on the way to burning some fat tissue.
Yeah, man. And that's literally how, as bad as it sounds at the back end, when I'm like, all I think, I'm so hungry, I'm like, I'm getting so shredded right now. Because you know that hunger is a sign that obviously there is not enough energy available to fund your daily expenditure. So your body is using adipose tissue to fuel your energy demand. So in your head, I'm like, I'm getting shredded.
It's shredded, that's it.
Yep. Fat free. Yep.
Fat free.
I just want to ask a couple more interesting questions that came through that I thought you may or may not have an answer to this, but I'll ask this to both of you. I might start with you, MT. Looking back at the start of your career as a coach, look back now knowing what you know and think that you gave some bad advice back then?
You cut out a little bit. So you said, if I look back now at my whole career, do you think...
Back to the start, knowing what you know now, like, do you think that potentially you could have given out any bad advice when you first started?
I don't know, bad, like detrimental advice, but I could have given out better advice, of course, because I'm a lot better coach I am now than I was back then. But I don't think I gave out any advice that was bad and was detrimental and I shouldn't have given, and it didn't give the result we wanted, because I'm pretty happy with all the results I've gotten so far with everyone. I think I did some
saying,
things
like, you know, potentially feeding into some of the bro mythology, or like, you know, maybe there was a more efficient way to do it that we know now that we didn't know back then.
I think there's some things I did with training that I'm like, I probably didn't even do that, wasn't really necessary. So I know there was like a big thing about like number of sets you needed to do per muscle group, per workout, per blah, blah, blah. And I probably went a little bit, I don't want to say, I went on the top end of that. And I don't think I needed to with some of my exercises and some of the things I did. That's from a training perspective. From a food perspective, I think now, I don't think I gave any bad advice, but I think now I'm just very meticulous in what people do with their food. Whereas back then I was probably like, yeah, meal plan, sweet, give you that. Or yeah, if it's
whatever you want in it.
Do you think? Now I'm like, no. I'm looking at everything you do.
Yeah.
So I think like that's kind of changed a little bit. But I don't think I gave out any like bad advice or like, whoa, that was bad. I should never have done that. Never done.
Scott, let me ask you this. What would you say to anyone who is not tracking and measuring their lifts?
I think you're missing a pretty big piece to the puzzle. So I think if you're truly a lover of bodybuilding, you understand both sides of it. There's the period of getting shredded, which I feel like as guys, we perhaps find it a little bit easier to be able to, you know, so even, you know, you, MG, you've just finished prep and you've managed your recovery like a pro. You've got no dramas. You understand that you need to gain some fat mass in order to be able to do what you need to do in the gym to make the improvements that you need to make. So I think that definitely makes it a lot easier if you can separate the two. But if you're not tracking, and again, I have a philosophy, if you can't measure it, you can't manipulate it. But if you don't know what you're lifting, and not that our loads determine how much more, you know, contractile tissue that we accrue, but it's a pretty good indicator. So if you're deep in your off season and you're pulling numbers, whether it's a deadlift or you're pressing or whatever it is, and you're doing things that you weren't even close to doing, you know, 12 months or 14 months earlier, you know that obviously you're trending in the right direction. And I think it's more so important in the off season to track those numbers, because it can be very easy to be complacent. And that's where I think you're either, if you're a part-time bodybuilder, you sort of just go in, you don't really have a plan. I'll do a bit of shoulders, I'll do a bit of chest. Whereas I think if you've pre-planned and programmed your volume allotment, what you're going to do, you might change a few bits and pieces on the fly, but I think it's important to have that structure and to be that methodical, because that allows you each progression and each mesocycle should transition into the next. So
yeah.
I think if you're not tracking your numbers,
Yeah.
you know, you're potentially you're not doing things as optimally as you could. You're doing it kind of half-assed.
Yeah. Yeah. Good call. There's actually a question that kind of leads a little bit on from that. It says, what post-comp protocols do you use to make sure your clients' hormone levels go back to their baseline post-comp?
Well, if we have the option to get blood markers prior or pre-prep and then post, which, you know, we did that. And as to be expected, you know, testosterone is normally pretty much in the toilet when you first finish a contest prep. But again, there's no magic time frame, or 400 grams of carbohydrate for males on a 4-week protocol is going to return testosterone to baseline levels, or you're just going to feel amazing. It just comes down to the individual. But again, yeah, you have to understand. And it depends also how lean they got. You know, in your case, you know, you, as we like to say, you were fat-free, man. You were shredded to the bone. So I don't expect you to hormonally, physically,
yeah.
even though you're like, I feel pretty good. In 8 weeks' time, you'd be like, man, I feel so much better than I did when we did that live, because you don't know quite what you're feeling. So I think it's important. Reversing to an extent is helpful, but if someone's been truly shredded, then you don't want to reverse them out. Recovery diet, put some instant fat mass on, feed them, get them to train, and then it's important to check in, you know, looking at hormonally, you know, for guys and for girls, we're looking at their libido. You know, at the back end of prep, it's non-existent. You know, if that starts to change, then obviously you know that you're trending in the right direction. You know, even again, as we spoke about, I think it's important, you know, as we get older, to check in with our partners. You know, we go through the endeavor of getting shredded. It's such a selfish sport, and it requires so much focus around us as individuals. It's important to check in with your partner and in prep and also out. So if you're 4 weeks out, 4 weeks post-show, you can be like, do I seem any different? Do I feel like I'm a little bit more upbeat? I feel like I'm good. And they might be like, yeah, a little bit, or maybe not. So sometimes you can be oblivious because we kind of just have tunnel vision the way we are.
You get used to it as well, don't you? You get used to that feeling.
You do, yeah. You adapt to that life of just feeling shitty, and you forget what it's like. And you might not think that you talk a bit slower and you maybe don't have as much enthusiasm in your voice, but, you know, Michael Trimboli, you guys might catch up on a Sunday and kick it at his joint by the pool, and he's having a conversation, and you're like, huh, what did you say, man? Like, I missed that because you got so much brain fog. Yeah, versus 6 weeks or 8 weeks later, he's like, man, you're a different person.
For sure. And I think I said to you, you know, 3 or 4 weeks post-show that I felt fantastic, and then went and got my bloods done, and they still weren't recovered. So I was already feeling better, but hadn't quite recovered from a hormone perspective yet. So,
yeah, and again, it's important, and I think it's important as well if you're having these conversations. So, again, like we had discussed before your first show, just so we know, this is roughly what our recovery protocol is going to look like. And again, it helps that you're obviously very educated, so you understand from a physiological perspective, when you go down to that level of composition, there's always going to be some recoil. And especially when we don't have pharmacy aid to help keep things on a certain level as natural. So it's one of those things, as cliche as it sounds, it's just time and then consistency and doing what your coach prescribes you to do, and not being like, oh fuck, I went out and had burgers last night, so now I'm going to have a low day and do cardio today. Whereas if I have people do that, I'm like, just eat, don't worry about it, pick up where you left off, because
otherwise you're just
all you're doing is you're just digging the hole deeper again than we need to. We want to fill it up and just get back to normal.
Definitely.
Yeah,
so man, guys, I think we'll leave it there. Both the other boys will be happy. If anyone's got any questions that you'd like to hit us up off air, just send us a DM. We'll definitely try and get both of them back on at some stage. But I'd like to thank both of them for taking their time on an evening. I know you both worked all day, so thank you so much. And thanks for all your wealth of knowledge and experience. We appreciate it.
Thanks, man. It was awesome. Well, got to do it again.
Welcome, man. Yeah, absolutely. I think jumping on and have a chat with everyone was really good. So good to see you, boys.
You too, mate. Thanks, guys. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for joining in.
Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.